A few months before Richard Byrd's death, a visitor noticed something strange. The famous explorer was looking through old Antarctic photographs, not speaking, not writing, just staring. The images showed aircraft parked on endless ice, expedition camps buried in snow, and men standing in conditions most people would never willingly enter. When the visitor asked which expedition had been his favorite, Byrd didn't answer immediately. Instead, he continued studying one photograph for several seconds. Then he quietly said something that stayed with the man for years. "The hardest part wasn't what we found." He paused. "It was what the ice did to people." For a man who had spent decades exploring Antarctica, it was an unexpected answer. Most people imagined polar exploration as adventure, discovery, triumph. But Byrd knew another side of the story, a side hidden behind newspaper headlines and heroic photographs, because Antarctica had a way of changing people, sometimes physically, sometimes mentally, and sometimes in ways that were much harder to explain. Long before he became one of America's most celebrated explorers, Richard Byrd was simply a young man fascinated by places most people would never see. Born in Virginia in 1888, he grew up during a time when much of the world had already been mapped. The great age of exploration seemed to be fading. The blank spaces on maps were disappearing. Yet one place still resisted human understanding: Antarctica. Even in the early 20th century, enormous portions of the continent remained largely unknown. Few people had traveled deep into its interior. Fewer still had survived long enough to describe it. The stories that returned were rarely comforting: ships trapped in ice, men battling starvation, expeditions disappearing into storms. For most people, these stories sounded like warnings. For Byrd, they sounded like invitations. He entered the United States Navy and later became one of the early pioneers of military aviation. Flying itself was still dangerous then. Engines failed. Navigation was primitive. Weather forecasting remained unreliable. Yet Byrd was drawn toward challenges. Again and again, he chose difficult paths over comfortable ones. That mindset eventually transformed him into a national celebrity. Newspapers followed his expeditions. Crowds gathered to hear him speak. Children collected books about his adventures. To the public, Richard Byrd looked fearless. But the people who worked closely with him knew something different. He wasn't fearless. He was curious. And curiosity can drive people into places fear would normally keep them away from. By the late 1920s, Byrd's attention had become fixed on Antarctica. The frozen continent sat at the bottom of the world like a giant unanswered question. Scientists wanted data. Governments wanted maps. Explorers wanted discoveries. Byrd wanted all three. His expeditions would eventually carry hundreds of men southward across thousands of miles of ocean. The logistics alone were staggering. Every gallon of fuel mattered. Every crate of food mattered. Every mechanical failure could become a life-or-death problem. Yet despite the risks, volunteers continued signing up. Many were young. Some had never seen snow on the scale Antarctica offered. Others were experienced sailors and aviators seeking adventure. Few fully understood what awaited them. Years later, expedition members would describe their first glimpse of Antarctica in remarkably similar ways. Silence. That was the word many remembered, not because Antarctica was quiet. The wind could be deafening. Ice could crack with explosive force. Aircraft engines echoed across the landscape. Yet the continent itself felt silent, empty, almost detached from the rest of the world. One expedition member later recalled feeling as though they had landed on another planet. Another admitted he couldn't judge distance anymore. Mountains appeared close enough to touch, yet remained hours away. The landscape played tricks on the human mind, and that was before winter arrived. As Byrd led his early expeditions deeper into the continent, he became increasingly fascinated by more than geography. The ice was teaching him something unexpected. Every man reacted differently to Antarctica. Some became energized by the challenge. Others struggled with isolation. Some handled danger calmly but found loneliness unbearable. Others endured solitude well but faltered when responsibility increased. The continent seemed to reveal parts of people they didn't know existed, including Byrd himself. At first, these were simply observations, interesting details, notes from a leader watching his crew adapt to extreme conditions. But over time, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Antarctica wasn't merely testing equipment, it was testing human beings. And the deeper Byrd traveled into the frozen wilderness, the more convinced he became that the greatest discoveries there might not be found on a map at all. They might be found inside the people brave enough to venture into the ice. What Byrd didn't know was that one decision, made in the early 1930s, would force him to confront that truth personally. It was a decision so risky that some members of his own expedition quietly questioned it. A decision that would leave him completely alone in one of the harshest environments on Earth. And before it was over, that decision would bring him closer to death than any storm, aircraft accident, or expedition crisis he had faced before. The idea sounded unreasonable the moment Byrd proposed it. Even by Antarctic standards, his men had already endured brutal weather, mechanical failures, and months of isolation. They understood hardship better than most people on Earth. Yet when Byrd explained his plan, several of them exchanged uneasy looks. He wanted to spend the winter alone, not at the main camp, not surrounded by dozens of crew members. Alone, more than 100 miles from Little America at a small outpost known as Advance Base. The station had one purpose: scientific observation, weather measurements, atmospheric data. Information that could only be gathered through continuous monitoring during the darkest months of the Antarctic winter. The work mattered. Scientists back home were eager for the data, but there was a problem: the location. Advance Base sat in a world of darkness, snow, and isolation. Once winter tightened its grip, reaching it could become nearly impossible. If something went wrong, help might arrive too late. The risk wasn't theoretical. Everyone knew it, including Byrd. Yet the more he considered the mission, the more determined he became. Part of that determination came from his personality. Throughout his life, he had asked others to take difficult risks. He believed a leader should be willing to do the same. But another reason was harder to explain. Byrd wanted to experience Antarctica in a way few people ever had, not through brief visits, not through crowded camps. He wanted to understand what happened when a person was left alone with the continent itself. As preparations began, the crew worked carefully. Food supplies were packed, fuel was loaded, scientific instruments were checked and rechecked. Every item had to last for months. Every mistake could have consequences later. One expedition member later admitted that watching Byrd leave felt strange, not because they doubted his abilities, because they knew exactly how unforgiving Antarctica could be. Byrd arrived at Advance Base in early 1934. The station was small, a narrow living space carved into one of the most hostile environments on Earth. Outside stood a landscape that seemed endless. No cities, no roads, no lights, nothing but snow, ice, and sky stretching toward the horizon. When the support team departed, the silence arrived almost immediately. Byrd watched them disappear into the distance. Their vehicles became tiny dots, then nothing. For the first time in months, there were no conversations, no meetings, no crew members seeking instructions, no sounds except the wind. At first, he welcomed it. His daily routine was demanding but manageable. Each morning, he recorded weather observations, measured temperatures, checked instruments, maintained equipment, prepared reports for radio transmission. The work gave shape to the days, and during the early weeks that structure seemed enough. Then winter arrived, not gradually, completely. The sun vanished. Darkness settled over the continent. Weeks passed without daylight. The cold intensified. Outside temperatures plunged far below anything most people could imagine. Even simple tasks became dangerous. A short trip outside required preparation. A small mistake could lead to frostbite. A larger mistake could become fatal. Yet what surprised Byrd most wasn't the weather, it was the loneliness. At first he treated it like another challenge, something to be managed, something to overcome. But isolation works differently than physical hardship. A storm announces itself, cold can be measured, loneliness moves quietly. Some days passed normally, others seemed strangely long, hours stretched, time blurred. Without sunlight, even the calendar began feeling abstract. Back at Little America, dozens of men shared stories, meals, frustrations, and laughter. At Advance Base, there was only silence waiting at the end of every task. To stay focused, Byrd threw himself deeper into his work. He filled notebooks, collected data, maintained schedules, read books during spare moments, and when possible he communicated by radio with the main camp. Those radio conversations became lifelines, brief reminders that other people still existed beyond the darkness. Then something unexpected happened. The scientific observations themselves began revealing fascinating details. Byrd watched storms develop across enormous distances, recorded weather patterns rarely seen by human observers, gathered information that would help scientists better understand Antarctica. For a time, the mission appeared to be succeeding. The risk seemed worthwhile. The data was valuable, and Byrd was proving that a single individual could survive one of the harshest winters on Earth. Then small problems started appearing. Nothing dramatic, nothing alarming, just little things. A headache, unusual fatigue, difficulty concentrating, the sort of symptoms anyone might dismiss, especially someone as stubborn as Richard Byrd. He blamed exhaustion, the weather, the workload, perhaps even the isolation. Anything seemed more likely than the truth, so he continued working, continued sending reports, continued reassuring everyone that things were fine, but the headaches kept returning, and each time they seemed a little worse. At first he could ignore them. Soon, ignoring them became harder. Then one morning, while trying to complete a routine task he had performed dozens of times before, Byrd suddenly stopped. For a moment, he couldn't remember what he was doing. The realization unsettled him, not because of the mistake itself, because mistakes were becoming more frequent. And somewhere in the darkness of Antarctica, Richard Byrd began wondering whether the greatest threat to his survival wasn't outside the station at all. It might already be inside with him. Byrd didn't tell anyone how worried he was, at least not at first. That wasn't unusual. Like many leaders of his generation, he had spent years solving problems quietly. If something went wrong, you fixed it. If conditions became difficult, you endured them. And if people depended on you, you avoided giving them reasons to worry. So when the headaches worsened, Byrd kept working. When dizziness appeared, he kept working. When exhaustion began creeping into even the simplest tasks, he kept working. Every day followed the same routine: record observations, check instruments, send reports, maintain the station. The work had become more than a responsibility. It was proof that he was still in control. But Antarctica has a way of exposing reality, no matter how determined a person might be. One evening, Byrd sat at his desk preparing weather data for transmission. The task should have taken only a few minutes. Instead, he found himself staring at the numbers. Something felt wrong. His thoughts seemed slow, disorganized. He struggled to focus. Several times he had to reread the same figures. The mistake disturbed him, not because it happened, because it wasn't the first time. During the following days, the symptoms intensified. Simple jobs took longer. His sleep became restless. Sometimes he woke with pounding headaches. Other times he found himself unusually weak after even minor physical effort. The station felt colder than before, or perhaps he felt weaker. He couldn't be sure. For the first time since arriving at Advance Base, doubt entered his mind. What if he had underestimated the challenge? What if Antarctica was winning? Back at Little America, radio operators noticed subtle changes. Nothing dramatic, nothing that immediately suggested a crisis, but they knew Byrd well. His messages had always been precise, organized, professional. Now they occasionally arrived late. Some sounded unusually brief. Others lacked their normal clarity. The differences were small, yet experienced expedition members pay attention to small things. Small things often become big problems. Meanwhile, Byrd began searching for explanations. Perhaps the isolation was affecting him. Scientists already knew that long periods of solitude could influence concentration and mood. Perhaps the darkness was responsible, perhaps stress, perhaps exhaustion. All seemed possible, yet something didn't fit. The symptoms were becoming physical, and they were becoming worse. One night he stepped outside to check equipment during severe weather. The cold struck immediately. Ice crystals swirled through the darkness. The wind pushed against him with surprising force. Even simple movement required effort. By the time he returned inside, he felt strangely drained, more drained than the situation should have caused. He sat down, removed his gloves, and noticed his hands trembling. That frightened him, not because of the trembling itself, because he couldn't explain it. Byrd had spent years surviving difficult conditions. He knew his own limits, or at least he thought he did. Now those limits seemed to be changing. The following week brought a series of alarming moments. He forgot routine procedures, lost track of time, found himself staring into space for reasons he couldn't understand. At one point, he nearly made a serious error while operating equipment. That mistake shook him. The scientific mission mattered, but survival mattered more. And for the first time, Richard Byrd began considering the possibility that he might not be able to finish the winter alone. Still, he hesitated. Requesting help wasn't a simple decision. Advance Base sat roughly 123 miles from Little America. That distance might not sound enormous on a map. In Antarctica, it was another matter entirely. Between Byrd and the main camp lay some of the harshest conditions on Earth. Rescuers would face darkness, extreme cold, unpredictable storms, mechanical failures. Every mile carried risk. If he called for help too early, he might endanger others unnecessarily. If he waited too long, he might not survive. The dilemma weighed heavily on him. And there was another factor: pride. Not the arrogant kind. The kind many dedicated people carry. The belief that they should handle their own problems. The belief that others already have enough burdens. The belief that asking for help should be a last resort. So Byrd continued pushing forward. Days passed. Then came the moment that changed everything. While moving around the station, he suddenly became so weak that he had to stop and steady himself. For several seconds, the room seemed to spin. His heart raced. His thoughts felt distant. And in that moment, he realized something terrifying. This wasn't improving. It wasn't stabilizing. Whatever was happening, it was getting worse. Much worse. Somewhere inside the station, an invisible threat was slowly taking his strength away. And if he couldn't identify it soon, Antarctica might claim one of its most famous explorers without a single storm, accident, or dramatic rescue ever taking place. The realization came slowly. Then all at once. For weeks, Byrd had been searching for answers in the wrong places. He blamed the darkness, the isolation, the stress, the workload, but none of those explanations fully accounted for what was happening to him. One evening, while sitting near the stove, he noticed something strange. The symptoms seemed worse when he spent long periods inside the station. The headaches grew stronger. The dizziness became more noticeable. His thinking became clouded. At first, it was only a suspicion, nothing more. But once the idea entered his mind, he couldn't ignore it. The stove, the very thing keeping him alive through the Antarctic winter, could it also be harming him? Byrd began examining the station more carefully, checking ventilation, inspecting equipment, looking for anything unusual. What he found was deeply troubling. A problem with the ventilation system appeared to be allowing dangerous gases to accumulate inside the shelter. The station had become a trap, not because of the ice outside, because of the air inside. Today, carbon monoxide poisoning is widely understood. In 1934, knowledge existed, but detecting it in a remote Antarctic outpost was another matter entirely. The gas had no smell, no color, no obvious warning signs. It simply replaced the oxygen a person needed, slowly, quietly, day after day. The discovery answered one question, but it created another. Had he figured it out in time? Byrd immediately tried improving ventilation wherever possible, but the damage had already been done. Weeks of exposure had weakened him severely. Some days he could barely complete routine tasks. Other days he struggled simply to stay awake. His notebooks from this period reveal a man fighting not just Antarctica, but his own declining condition. Yet what stands out is not panic, it's determination. Even while sick, Byrd continued gathering observations, continued maintaining equipment, continued sending reports whenever possible. He understood that people back at Little America depended on those communications. And increasingly, they were becoming worried. Radio operators noticed longer gaps between transmissions. Messages sometimes arrived incomplete. At times, Byrd sounded confused. One operator later admitted that something felt wrong long before they knew exactly what was happening. The voice coming through the radio wasn't the same voice they remembered. The confidence remained. The strength did not. Concern spread through the camp. Conversations became more serious. Crew members reviewed weather forecasts repeatedly. Everyone understood the challenge. A rescue mission in Antarctic winter wasn't impossible, but it was dangerous. The continent had already claimed lives during previous expeditions. No one took such decisions lightly. Still, doing nothing was becoming increasingly difficult to justify. As conditions deteriorated, Byrd finally began revealing more of the truth. Not all of it. Even then, he minimized the severity of his situation. He worried that others would take unnecessary risks to reach him. That concern reflected one of the qualities his men respected most. Even while facing danger himself, he remained focused on the safety of others. Unfortunately, reality was becoming impossible to hide. The symptoms continued worsening. Simple movements exhausted him. Concentration became difficult. Sometimes he found himself staring at equipment without remembering why he had approached it. At night, the station felt especially oppressive. The walls seemed smaller, the silence heavier, the darkness endless. Outside, Antarctica continued exactly as it always had, indifferent, unmoved. Storms crossed the ice, temperatures plunged. The wind carved patterns through the snow. The continent neither knew nor cared that one of the world's most famous explorers was fighting for his life inside a tiny outpost. That thought stayed with Byrd, because Antarctica had taught him a lesson many times before. Nature doesn't make exceptions, not for experience, not for courage, not for reputation. In the end, survival depends on reality, not confidence. Back at Little America, the decision was finally made. A rescue team would go. The risks were obvious. Everyone understood them. Vehicles could fail. Weather could change. Visibility could disappear. The rescuers themselves might become victims. Yet there are moments when responsibility leaves no alternative. This was one of them. Preparations began immediately. Fuel was gathered. Routes were reviewed. Equipment was checked and rechecked. The men volunteering for the mission knew exactly what they were facing, and perhaps that was why their decision carried so much weight. They weren't acting out of ignorance. They understood the danger better than anyone, and they were going anyway. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles from safety, Richard Byrd waited, not knowing exactly when help would arrive, not knowing whether weather would allow them to reach him, not knowing whether his body could hold out much longer. For the first time since arriving at Advanced Base, survival was no longer something he could accomplish alone. And somewhere beyond the darkness, a group of men had begun a journey that would determine whether he ever left Antarctica alive. The rescue team left Little America knowing that failure was a real possibility. No one said it aloud. They didn't need to. Every man on the expedition understood what an Antarctic winter could do. The cold alone could disable machinery. A storm could erase tracks within minutes. One wrong turn in poor visibility could leave rescuers as stranded as the man they were trying to save. Yet the mission moved forward. Because somewhere out on the ice, Richard Byrd was running out of time. The journey was slow from the very beginning. Vehicles crawled across snow-covered terrain. The darkness complicated navigation. Drivers often had to trust instruments and experience more than their own eyes. Some stretches of the route felt endless. The landscape rarely changed, just darkness, wind, snow, and the constant awareness that a single mechanical failure could create another emergency. For the younger men, the mission was unforgettable. Many had admired Byrd long before joining the expedition. They had read about his flights, his discoveries, his achievements. Now they were crossing Antarctica to save him, but admiration wasn't what pushed them forward. Loyalty was. Over the years, Byrd had earned a reputation for sharing hardship with his crews. He wasn't a distant figure issuing orders from safety. He worked alongside his men, accepted risks himself, expected much but demanded no more from others than he was willing to endure. That mattered in Antarctica. Trust mattered, perhaps more than anywhere else on Earth. As the rescue party advanced, radio communication remained uncertain. Some messages got through, others didn't. Weather conditions frequently interfered. The men knew Byrd was alive, but they couldn't be sure how much longer that would remain true. Back at Advance Base, Byrd continued fighting through each day. His world had become painfully small. The station, the radio, the stove, the scientific instruments, everything else felt distant, almost unreal. Even simple activities required effort, preparing meals, recording observations, maintaining equipment. Tasks that once filled the day now consumed nearly all his remaining strength. Yet one thing remained remarkably consistent. He kept working. Many years later, readers of his book alone would be struck by that fact. Not because he ignored danger, because he continued finding purpose despite it. The scientific mission still mattered to him. The observations still mattered. Even when survival became uncertain, he wanted the expedition to succeed. That determination revealed both his greatest strength and one of his greatest weaknesses. Byrd often pushed himself beyond reasonable limits. The same quality that helped him accomplish extraordinary things sometimes prevented him from recognizing when he needed help. It's a trait many people can recognize. The belief that if you work harder, endure longer, or stay strong enough, the problem will eventually solve itself. Sometimes that works. Sometimes it doesn't. In Byrd's case, waiting too long nearly cost him his life. As the rescue team fought its way across the ice, conditions continued deteriorating around Advance Base. One storm in particular struck with unusual force. Wind hammered the station. Snow piled against the structure. Visibility disappeared entirely. Inside, Byrd listened to the storm and wondered whether the rescuers had been forced to turn back. The thought troubled him, not because he feared being alone. He had already faced that reality for months. What troubled him was the possibility that others might risk their lives because of him. The burden of leadership doesn't disappear during a crisis. If anything, it becomes heavier. Byrd had spent years making decisions that affected other people. Now he found himself on the opposite side of that equation. Others were risking everything to save him, and there was nothing he could do except wait. Days later, after battling weather, distance, and mechanical challenges, the rescue party finally approached Advance Base. As they drew closer, anxiety spread through the group. No one knew what they would find. Would Byrd be standing? Would he be conscious? Would they be too late? The answers waited beyond the next stretch of ice. Then the station appeared, a small shape emerging from darkness and drifting snow. At first glance it looked unchanged, silent, still, almost swallowed by the Antarctic landscape. The men pressed forward. Every minute mattered now. For Richard Byrd, the long period of isolation was finally nearing its end. But the experience had already changed him. The famous explorer who had arrived at Advanced Base months earlier believed he understood Antarctica. The man waiting inside the station understood something different. The continent wasn't merely a place to be explored. It was a force capable of exposing human limits in ways few environments ever could. And that lesson would remain with him long after the rescue mission ended. Because although Byrd was about to survive one of the greatest ordeals of his life, Antarctica was far from finished shaping his story. When the rescuers finally entered Advanced Base, the first thing they noticed wasn't the station. It was Byrd. He was alive. That alone brought relief, but the condition he was in shocked them. The energetic explorer who had left Little America months earlier looked noticeably thinner. His face appeared drawn. His movements were slower. Even standing seemed to require effort. One crew member later admitted that the sight was difficult to forget. This was Richard Byrd, the man many Americans viewed as nearly unstoppable. Yet Antarctica had reduced him to a man fighting simply to get through each day. The rescuers immediately began assessing the situation. They inspected equipment, checked the ventilation system, reviewed the station's condition. The source of the problem soon became clear. Carbon monoxide. An invisible threat had nearly succeeded where storms, crevasses, and freezing temperatures had failed. It was a sobering realization. For months, newspapers would have imagined dramatic dangers if they had known the story. Blizzards, aircraft crashes, a heroic struggle against the elements. Instead, the real danger had been quietly accumulating inside the very shelter meant to protect him. That contrast stayed with many expedition members, and it stayed with Byrd, because survival often depends less on the dangers we expect and more on the ones we overlook. The immediate crisis eventually passed. Additional support arrived. Conditions improved. And as Antarctica slowly emerged from winter, Byrd's health began recovering. But physical recovery is only part of any survival story. The deeper impact often takes longer to understand. During the months that followed, Byrd found himself reflecting on the experience more than he expected. Not simply because he had nearly died, because of what the ordeal had revealed. For years, he had explored some of the most remote places on Earth. He had crossed oceans, led expeditions, flown over regions few human beings had ever seen. Yet his greatest challenge had occurred inside a small hut barely visible on a map. Alone with his thoughts, alone with uncertainty, alone with the possibility that help might never arrive. The experience forced difficult questions. Questions many people avoid whenever possible. What matters when everything else is stripped away? What remains when achievement, reputation, and ambition no longer seem important? What gives a person the strength to continue when nobody is watching? Byrd didn't claim to have discovered all the answers, but the questions stayed with him, and in many ways they shaped the years that followed. When he returned home, the public celebrated another successful expedition. The headlines focused on accomplishments, scientific contributions, records, discoveries. Most people never fully understood how close the expedition had come to tragedy, and Byrd rarely dramatized it. That wasn't his style. If anything, he tended to understate difficult experiences. Yet privately, he began writing about what had happened. Those writings would eventually become Alone, one of the most influential survival accounts ever produced by a polar explorer. Readers expected adventure. What they often found instead was something more personal. A man confronting isolation, a man confronting weakness, a man confronting himself. The book resonated because it revealed a side of exploration rarely shown in newspaper photographs. Not the hero standing triumphantly beside a flag. The human being enduring fear, uncertainty, and loneliness. For many readers, that honesty proved more powerful than any record-breaking achievement. Years passed. The world changed rapidly. New technologies appeared. New conflicts emerged. And once again, Antarctica drew international attention. Aircraft had become more capable. Military planners had become more interested in polar regions. Scientists wanted more data than ever before. The frozen continent that had challenged Byrd in the 1930s was becoming increasingly important. By the mid-1940s, discussions were already underway about a new kind of Antarctic mission. Not a small expedition, not a handful of explorers, something far larger, far more ambitious. A mission involving thousands of personnel, advanced aircraft, and resources on a scale Antarctica had never seen before. For Richard Byrd, it would become one of the final major chapters of his career. And although he could not know it yet, the operation would introduce a new set of challenges, new questions, and experiences that historians would continue discussing long after his death. Because the Antarctica of the post-war world was very different from the Antarctica he had first encountered. The ice remained the same, the storms remained the same, but the people arriving there, and the reasons they came, were beginning to change. By the time Richard Byrd returned to Antarctica after World War II, he was no longer the young explorer chasing distant horizons. He was a national figure, a decorated naval officer, a veteran of multiple expeditions, a man whose name had become almost synonymous with polar exploration. But experience does something interesting to people. It doesn't always make them more confident. Sometimes it makes them more cautious, because experience teaches the true cost of mistakes. In 1946, Byrd found himself overseeing what was then the largest Antarctic expedition ever attempted. Thousands of personnel, multiple ships, aircraft, specialized equipment. The scale was unlike anything he had seen during his earlier years on the ice. To younger participants, the operation felt enormous. To Byrd, it was also a reminder of how much the world had changed. The Antarctica he first explored had belonged largely to adventurers and scientists. Now governments, militaries, and research organizations all recognized the continent's importance. The frozen wilderness was no longer just a destination. It had become a strategic frontier. Yet despite the modern equipment and vast resources, Antarctica remained stubbornly unchanged in one important way. It still demanded humility. Storms disrupted plans, weather delayed operations. Nature continued setting the rules. The same lesson Byrd had learned years earlier at Advanced Base remained true. Human beings could prepare, they could innovate, they could organize, but they could never completely control the continent. Perhaps that realization explains why Byrd continued to fascinate people long after his expeditions ended. Not because he conquered Antarctica. No one truly conquers Antarctica. He respected it, he learned from it, and he survived it. As the years passed, Byrd gradually stepped away from active exploration. Age was beginning to catch up with him. The demanding physical challenges that once defined his life became less frequent, but the memories remained vivid. The faces of expedition members, the sound of aircraft engines over endless ice, the long Antarctic nights, the moments of triumph, the moments of fear, the moments when survival balanced on decisions that could never be taken back. Friends who knew him during his later years often noticed that he spoke less about accomplishments and more about people. The crews, the friendships, the sacrifices, the individuals who made exploration possible. That shift says a great deal about how he viewed his own legacy. Because in the end, history is rarely just about events. It's about human beings, about the choices they make when circumstances become difficult, about what they discover, not only about the world but about themselves. Richard Byrd's story endures because it contains both. The adventure is remarkable. The human experience is even more remarkable. A young man chased a dream to the edge of the earth. A leader accepted responsibility for others in one of the harshest environments imaginable. A survivor endured months of isolation and nearly lost his life to an invisible danger. And through it all, he continued asking questions, continued learning, continued exploring, not because the path was easy, because he believed understanding the unknown was worth the risk. Today, Antarctica still captures the imagination. Scientists continue studying it. Researchers continue making discoveries beneath its ice and across its vast landscape. Many questions have been answered since Byrd's time. Many remain unanswered. That's the nature of exploration. Every generation inherits mysteries from the one before it, then leaves new questions for the next. Perhaps that's why stories like Byrd still resonate nearly a century later. Not because most of us will ever visit Antarctica, most never will, but because everyone understands uncertainty. Everyone faces moments when the future feels unclear. Everyone encounters challenges that test patience, courage, and resilience. And in those moments, the experiences of people like Richard Byrd remind us of something important. Human beings are often capable of more than they believe. Sometimes the greatest victories aren't measured in miles traveled or records broken. Sometimes they're measured in endurance, in perseverance, in refusing to give up when giving up would be easier. Richard Byrd spent much of his life searching for what lay beyond the horizon. What he found was not just a frozen continent. He found proof that the limits we imagine for ourselves are often far smaller than the limits we actually possess. And that may be the most lasting discovery of all. Before we close, I'd love to know something. Where are you watching from, and what time is it there right now? And if you enjoy stories that bring history to life through the people who lived it, consider subscribing and joining us for the next journey into the forgotten echoes of the past. Because somewhere in history, another remarkable story is waiting to be told.